What's up everyone, Amichai here. In today's video, we're going to talk about domain events. We're going to see why this is such a crucial and fundamental topic when it comes to domain-driven design and how the domain events pattern allows us to actually communicate between various aggregates. A domain event is simply an event or something that happened within our system, something that's interesting from a business point of view, and it's defined in past tense. So because we're working on a dinner hosting platform, then the types of events that we can expect to have are stuff like menu created, dinner reserved, dinner updated, and so on. Now, the beauty of doing event storming is that after event storming, the artifact that we have contains all the various domain events, the commands, the aggregates, everything we expect in the process that we modeled. In our case, it's this process. And then we're able to extract from the event storming artifact all the various entities that we have, and we can go ahead and model our domain layer and define all our aggregates and entities. If you missed this video, then I'll link it over here so you can catch up. Up until now, we have the various aggregates, we have the entities, we have the relationships that they have with one another. But now the question is, how do we have changes to one aggregate affect another aggregate? So for that, let's look specifically at the dinner and the menu. So like we said, every dinner has to be associated with some menu. That's why the dinner has the menu ID that it's associated to, and the menu has all the various dinner IDs that are associated with this menu. Now the question is, how do we, when we create a new dinner, how do we add it to the list of dinner IDs over here? The reason why this isn't a trivial question is, like we said in domain-driven design, aggregates are transactional boundaries, meaning that changes to this aggregate cannot affect this aggregate. That's the reason why the dinner IDs over here aren't foreign keys that are associated to the actual dinner, meaning that we can't just create the new dinner, store it in the database, and have this dinner ID added to the menu aggregate, but we need to think of something else. Okay? That's where domain events come into play, where what we do is each entity in our system can store 0 or more domain events. And then when we're storing the aggregate in the database, then what we'll do is we'll extract from the aggregate all the various domain events and we'll publish them. Then we'll have some event handler that will listen to that event. In our case, it's going to be the dinner created domain event. So we're going to have some handler listening to that event and adding the dinner ID to the menu. Okay, so that's how aggregates communicate with one another. So basically, when you want changes to one aggregate to affect another aggregate, the way you do it is you create event handlers and they apply the changes that you want to be applied. In this video, we're going to focus specifically on the menu created domain event inside the menu aggregate. So over here, we have our file system or the relevant files in our file system, and we're looking at the flow of creating a menu. So we'll invoke the create menu method in the menus controller in the application layer, which in turn will invoke the create menu command handler in the application layer. So over here in the domain layer, we have the menu aggregate. So all the command handler needs to do is to create a new instance of the menu aggregate. Okay, so all of this we already have in our application. It exists from beforehand. What's new in today's video is that the menu aggregate as an entity within our system can contain 0 or more domain events. And over here, each one of our entities will have a new folder other than the various entities and value objects. It will also have a list of domain events, and these are the events that can happen within this aggregate or the entities that are within this aggregate. Then when we do the actual operation on the aggregate, it will create the corresponding domain event, which will be stored within the list of domain events in the aggregate. Then when we call save changes on our DB context in our infrastructure layer, we're going to be invoking the publish domain events interceptor, which will be in charge of pulling the various domain events and publishing them via mediator. So each one of the domain events in our system is going to be a notification or a mediator notification. And over here, we're going to publish them to the mediator publisher. And what's going to happen is it's going to invoke the corresponding handlers. In our case, we're just going to be creating a dummy menu created event handler, which will be invoked and will do something just so we see that it works all together. So that's what we're going to be doing today. So let's jump right in and implement it in the Boober dinner application. Okay, so the focus is on the domain layer. So inside here, we have in the models, all the various base types that we need. What we're going to be adding to here are two things. The first one is the domain event interface. Let's start with that. So domain event. Okay, so we have our domain event interface. Let's go to the entity. And like we said, let's create here a list of domain events. So let's say over here, private, read only. And this is going to be simply a list of iDomain event. And we'll call it domain events. Let's initialize it with an empty list. So this is never in an invalid null state. And let's create a way to retrieve the list of domain events. So let's say over here, public read only list. Yes, this one. iDomain event, and let's call it domain events. And what this will do is we'll simply return the domain events as read only. The next thing that we want to do is we want to actually create the domain event that will be stored inside this list when it occurs. So for that, let's go to the menus aggregate, and over here alongside the entities and the value objects, let's create a new folder and let's call it events. Inside here, we're going to create the menu created domain event. Let's say menu created, and this will be a simple record where we're going to have the menu created domain event, and this is going to hold the menu that was created. And because this is a domain event, so let's inherit from the iDomain event interface. Okay, so that's it. We have the menu created domain event. We have the list of domain events in the entity. All we have left to do is in the menu when we're calling the create method. Then over here, we also want to add the domain event to the list of domain events. So var menu equals new menu, and let's return it over here. And then once we have the menu instance, then let's add it to the list of domain events that the menu has. So let's say over here, add domain event. This is a method that we're going to create in a minute. And let's say over here, new menu created. This is the record that we just created, and let's pass it the menu because, as we said, this contains the menu that was just created. So we have this. Let's create the add domain event method. Now, because this is something that all the entities are going to have, so let's go back to our entity base class over here, and let's add this method. So down here, we're going to say public void add domain event, and it's going to receive a iDomain event domain event, and we're going to add it to the list of domain events that we have over here. So let's say over here, simply domain event, and that's it. Okay, so this is basically what we're going to have throughout our application. So in one of the entities, something is going to happen. In this case, we're creating a new menu. So what this is going to do is it's going to create the corresponding domain event and add it to the inner list of domain events inside that entity. Now all we have left to do is to extract the list of domain events, publish them within our system, and that will invoke the corresponding event handlers that will do whatever they need to do. Again, for each event, we may have multiple event handlers. That's why we're using the mediator notification, which supports having 0 or more notification handlers. So let's see how in the infrastructure layer, we can pull all the various domain events and publish them. So inside the persistence folder in the infrastructure layer, we're going to create here a new folder, and we're going to call it interceptors. And over here, we're going to create the publish domain events interceptor. So let's say over here, public class publish domain events interceptor. And this is going to implement the save changes interceptor from entity-framework core. And if we look at the base class, then we can see it has here all these various methods like saving changes, which is called right before it saves the changes, or the saved changes, which is called right after saving the changes in the database. And there are also some other methods here for when the saving changes failed and so on. So what we're going to do is we're going to override two methods over here, which is the saving changes and saving changes async. So let's say override saving changes and also saving changes async. this one over here. And what we want to do is that when we call save changes inside our application, so before storing it in the database, that's because we want it to be included in the same transaction, we want to extract all the various domain events and publish them. Then all the inner or recursively inner domain events that will be published and make changes to the database will all be inside the same transaction. Then if this transaction fails, what's going to happen is that everything will be rolled back and no changes will be applied, meaning that all our domain events and their side effects will either be applied together or they won't be applied at all. Now, it's important to notice that if you have handlers that, for example, send an email, then you may send an email and the transaction will fail, the database won't be updated, and the email has been sent. For those cases, there are a few patterns that we can follow or a few approaches that we can take, but since I'm not going to be covering them in this video, I just want you to keep in mind that when you're defining your domain events and the corresponding event handlers, you need to remember that all we're talking about are changes to the database. So if you have anything else that's happening which is not making changes in the database, then it doesn't fall under the umbrella of what we're talking about today. Because in the end, what we want is that within one transaction, all the changes to the database are going to be applied or not applied, okay? This is a solution that I think is suitable for most applications because it doesn't require extra ceremony that other solutions require. But please remember that you're also paying the latency of applying all the various side effects. So if you can't tolerate the extra latency in your application, then please wait for future videos because I'm going to be covering the various other options that we can take over here instead. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's continue to what we still have left to do over here, which is extract all the various domain events and publish them. So over here, let's say private void publish domain events, and this is going to receive the DB context, and we'll see in a moment how we're going to get hold of the DB context. So let's say DB context over here, and what we're going to do is we're going to be calling this method both from the saving changes in a synchronous manner and from the saving changes async in an asynchronous manner. Now, something that we can do is we can simply throw an exception from the saving changes method, and that way we're enforcing that everyone in our system must use the saving changes async method because that's of course what you want to do in IO operations. But in our case, I'm just going to be leaving it and you can do whatever you want just so we have both of the examples. So the way we're going to be calling it over here is the following. So first of all, let's change this to task and let's say the following. So over here, we're going to be calling the method and we can get the DB context from the event data dot context. So let's say get awaiter and get result. And over here, we'll do the same thing, but instead of get awaiter, get result, we're going to await the response and add here async. And now we also want to say async over here and to await calling the base method. And then we have the publish domain events method, which what we want here is the following. So first of all, we want to get hold of all the various entities, then get hold of all the various domain events. Then we want to publish the domain events, right? So over here we can say publish domain events. And lastly, we want to clear the domain events from the entities so they're not published twice, right? So clear domain events. First of all, let's check if the DB context is null. If it's null, then let's simply return over here and not continue. We don't need to do anything. Next, let's get all the entities. So let's say var entities and let's say DB context. Let's use the change tracker to get all the entries of a specific type. Okay, now it would be nice if we can simply write over here entity and get all the objects in the change tracker of type entity, but we can't do that because we have this TID over here, and I don't know of an easy or pretty way to do this using anti-framework core and reflection. So what we're going to be doing instead is an approach that I first saw used by Jason Taylor. If you're not familiar with his clean architecture template, then I'll link it over here. Make sure to check it out. It's not what he's doing today in the template, but this is something that I think is the best solution given our application. So let's see what this looks like. Let's go back to our domain layer, and in our domain layer under the models, let's create a new interface, and let's call it I has domain events. So public interface I has domain events. So first of all, we're going to have over here the list of I read only of domain event, and let's call it domain events, and let's say get. And the second and last method we're going to have over here is clear domain events, which, as the name suggests, will clear the list of domain events we have over here. And this is all we need to retrieve all the various entities and afterwards clear the list of domain events. The next thing we want to do is we want to go to the entity and over here add that it implements the I has domain events. Then this over here is the domain events that we just talked about in the interface. And we still need to implement the clear domain events method. So let's go ahead and add that. So all we want to do is we want to say domain events and clear, and that's it. Then what we can do back in the interceptor is say the following. Let's retrieve from the change tracker all the entries of type I has domain event. Then over here, let's take only the entries that the underlying entity has 0 or more, 1 or more domain events. So let's say any, and then let's select only the underlying entity, right? That's false. So now we have over here the entities with domain events. And now that we have the entities with domain events, then let's get hold of all the various domain events. So let's say over here, domain events, and we can get all the entities with domain events. Let's to list it over here. So this is actually executed. So from the entities with domain events, let's select many, and we want to flatten the list of domain events. So let's say entry.domain events, and let's to list this so we have a new list with all the domain events. Okay, now that we have this, the question is, did you notice the bug that we have over here? So if we publish the domain events, this will execute the various event handlers. And then the event handlers, when they arrive over here, the entities will still have the domain events in them, and it'll be recursively invoked until further notice. So what we want to do is we want to switch the order over here. And the first thing we want to do is first to clear the domain events from the entities and only then publish the domain events. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's say entities with domain events, and for each of them, we want to take the entity and we want to clear the domain events. Now, finally, we can publish the domain events. So let's say for each domain event in domain events, let's use mediator to publish them. So let's get a hold of our mediator using dependency injection. So let's say private read only I mediator, and let's create a constructor and inject it. And actually we can use the iPublisher interface following interface segregation principle because iPublisher is all we need. So let's take only the iPublisher. Let's do it also over here. And now that we have the mediator, let's go ahead and say mediator publish domain event. And of course, let's await this call. And that should be it for this file. Now that we have the interceptor, the question is, how do we actually have it invoked every time we call save changes? So for that, what we want to do is the following. Let's go to the dependency injection of the infrastructure layer. And over here where we have add persistence, let's also add the interceptor to the service collection. So let's say publish domain events interceptor. And now that we have this, let's go to the Boober dinner DB context and inject it over here. So let's say private read only publish domain events interceptor, publish domain events interceptor. And let's add this as a parameter and inject it like so. And now that we have this, we want to override the on configuring. So let's say on configuring. And over here, we have the options builder that allows us to add an interceptor. So let's say add interceptor, and let's add the publish domain events interceptor. Okay, another thing that we want to do over here is in the model builder, we will never want to store the list of domain events in the database. So we can simply say over here, ignore list of I domain events, and that's it. The last thing that we're missing, so if we're looking at the interceptor, So over here, we're publishing the domain event. But if we look at the iDomain event interface, we haven't defined that this is a mediator notification. For that, let's go ahead and say over here that this implements the iNotification interface. And let's add mediator to our domain layer because we haven't done that yet. So let's say .NET add, yes, to the domain layer, the package mediator. Okay, now a side note, I updated our project to use mediator 12 from mediator 11. So if you're following along, make sure to follow the migration documentation on the GitHub repository. Okay, so we have mediator. Let's add it over here. And now we have everything that we need. Let's make sure that this builds successfully. And also let's implement an event handler to make sure that this works end to end like we expect. So let's go to the menus folder in the application layer. And alongside the commands and queries, let's also create here an events folder. And over here, let's create just a dummy event handler. So public class dummy handler, and this will implement the iNotification handler for mediator, and the notification that we want to subscribe to or we want to handle is the menu created, right? So let's say menu created, and let's implement this interface. And over here, we get the domain event that was invoked, so we can use it as we want. So in our case, it's the menu created that has internally the menu that was just created. And for now, let's simply return task.completed task. Let's put a breakpoint over here. Let's run the application and make sure that everything works as we expect. Okay, the debugger is attached. Let's make the request. And we hit the command handler over here. Let's continue. And we see that we arrive at the create method in the menu aggregate. And over here, we can see that it was added successfully to the menu aggregate. So we can see we have the domain events, and we have over here the menu created event. If we continue, then we arrive at the publish domain events. The DB context isn't expected to be null, and it isn't. If we step over this, then we should have here a single entity that has a domain event. And this is indeed our menu with our menu created event over here. Over here, we're publishing the domain event. So let's click continue, and we arrive at our dummy handler. And over here, we have our domain event that internally has the menu with all the details that we expect. But of course, now the domain events is 0 because we cleared the domain events. Clicking play, we can see that this ends successfully and we get the response back. Okay, so we have domain events in our application. This is such a crucial piece of the puzzle when it comes to creating a domain-driven design project. Now, I know if you're following this for the first time or even not, you're thinking to yourself that there's a lot of boilerplate in our application needed to put it in the correct structure for domain-driven design. This is true. It's a big overhead when creating a new project, but I also hope that you're able to see how this creates structure. So if we're looking at the application layer, let's look specifically at the menu. Then we can see that we have over here the commands, the events, and the queries. And if you're simply opening this application or an application built following this strategy, then all you need to do is open the application layer. You can see all the various use cases that you have. You can see the commands, the queries, and the various events that have to do with this specific entity. This is a visibility from a folder structure point of view that you don't have in other applications. So if you're working on a project that has many teams, many team members that are working on the same code base, this enforces some structure that is easy to follow. And I hope that you can imagine how as the application grows, this stays more or less consistent as the solution grows. Not only does it stay structured, but also because we modeled our domain layer correctly, we don't have dependencies between our aggregates, and we can simply take a slice from our application and move it to a different application or a different bounded context as the application grows, and we need to refactor and simplify each one of our domains. So I hope this is starting to make sense and your head doesn't hurt too much. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new. Let me know in the comments, smash the like button, smash the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.